Right, hello, good afternoon. Thank you for your patience. Lovely to see you here, actually. And apparently we're streaming online as well, the camera up at the top. Those who are following online won't have access to the text and probably won't be able to hear if you're asking questions. So I will repeat them as best I can. What I'm sharing today, it actually comes from the old Introduction to Reformed Judaism course. And so I'm going to be sharing, it's called Death and Beyond. In our community, we're focusing on different aspects of death, what happens before you die, what happens, how can the community take care of you, what kind of rituals need to be observed after a person dies. And there's very often the question about the theological or the philosophical question about but what happens to a person after they die. And so I want to start with a little comment that quite bluntly nobody knows, and that's the point. And I want to be clear that, especially coming at this as a Reform rabbi, the idea that Jews believe this is not a reality in the Jewish community. One room, two Jews, three opinions. And that is exactly the same when it comes to death and the belief in afterlife or not, as it is with everything else, matters of halakha or anything else. And so what I'm sharing today is a variety of views. And you may be coming thinking, so Rabbi Neil's going to tell us, is my great aunt so-and-so still living alive in some present form? The answer is I'm not going to tell you. And I want to say that at the beginning because I think it's an important expression of how we as Reformed Jews study. Which is to say, here are the traditional perspectives. And then the tradition is Zil Gemor, go and study. Make your decision, your autonomous decision based on this. Hopefully an educated decision. But in some sense, this isn't about education, this is about people. This is about emotions and personality. This is about how do we connect with a person who has died. And so sometimes people say, well, the question is there life after death is the same as is there life on other planets, right? The answer is it doesn't matter because we're living on Earth. But I think that's not actually correct, because it does matter. It matters in terms of what does it mean to be alive now? And what does it mean for us when we live? How do we live? And what does it mean after we die? Who are we? And I think that's therefore makes it a very different question to is there life on other planets? Because it doesn't affect us. Whereas this does affect us. This affects us on an emotional level, on a real personal level. And so, when I share these things, please bear in mind it may bring up certain feelings for you. I might share, for example, a perspective that says there is no life after death. And you might think, well, that's not my experience. And that's good, that's healthy. Okay? Because I'm not here to turn around and say, I know the truth of what happens after you die, because I don't. I don't even know the truth of what happens when you're alive. So how could I even more so after you die? All I can share is the different perspectives of Judaism. So, with that in mind, for those who have a hand up, for those who are present, we're going to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour through various perspectives in Judaism. And as always, I'm going to cover like 2,000 years or 3,000 years of Jewish thought in an hour. And so please bear in mind that I could spend weeks, anyone who knows me knows I could do this, I could spend weeks talking about just one of these areas. And we could say, right, let's have a course on life after death in the Bible, and what does it mean? So bear in mind that this is highlights, to give us a taste. And if you want, I'm happy to suggest, I actually have a bibliography at the back, on the very final page, that we can suggest other places for further study. So since we're going to be studying, from the Bible and from rabbinic literature, there is a blessing, la'asok b'divrei Torah, which I will say, feel free to say amen, feel free to say the blessing itself, feel free to say nothing. There is a custom of saying 100 blessings a day, and as soon as people gather together for study, it just gives an opportunity to add one of your blessings to that tally of 100. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we start on page 2. In the Bible, this comes from Maurice Lamb. Maurice Lamb is an Orthodox rabbi who wrote The Jewish Way in Death and Mourning. It's a very interesting book. It's a very Orthodox book. It says, this is what you must do, whereas some Reform books will say, some people have the custom of this and some people have the custom of this. I actually really like Maurice Lamb's book, if for no other reason than near the end, it has a chart, and I'm a scientist, it has a chart of during the Shiva, these are the things that you can do. And these are the things you cannot do. And during Shloshim, these are the things you can do and cannot do. So during the first 7 days of someone's mourning, and during the first 30 days, and then during the first year, I actually think it's an excellent guide, at least for seeing the tradition. Maurice Lamb writes, the Bible, so vitally concerned with the actions of man in this world, and agonizing over his day-to-day morals, is relatively silent about the world to come. This very silence, he says, is a tribute to the awesome concept taken for granted, like the biosphere in which we live. No elaborate apologia, no complex abstractions are necessary. The Bible, which records the sacred dialogue between God and man, surely must be founded on the soul's eternal existence. It was not a matter of debate, as it became later in history, when whole movements interpreted scripture with slavish literalism and could not find the afterlife crystallized in letters and words. Or later yet, when philosophers began to apply the yardstick of rationalism to man's every hope and idea, and sought empirical proof of this conviction of the soul. It was a fundamental creed always present, though rarely articulated. So what Maurice Lamb seems to be saying is, the fact that the Bible almost never talks about any kind of life in the world to come shows that the Bible believes in the life in the world to come, because it didn't need to mention it. And therefore he says, those who turn around and say the Bible doesn't believe in a world to come because it doesn't mention it, he says that's just slavish literalism, and that's crazy, because you don't talk about the environment because you take it for granted. The irony is, of course, now all we do is talk about the environment, right? And we don't take it for granted. So Maurice Lamb is coming from an Orthodox perspective which is predicated on the idea that the Bible and rabbinic literature always say the same thing. We actually saw in our Foundations of Reformed Judaism this morning how they don't. For example, relating to patrilineality and matrilineality. Who is a Jew becomes very different between the Bible and rabbinic literature. So Maurice Lamb comes from a perspective that says they must be unified. And the rabbis spent a long time talking about it, but the Bible doesn't even need to talk about it. So the question for us as we read Lamb is he writing that as an Orthodox Jew to say it doesn't say it because it necessarily is there? Is that an apologetic idea? Or do we turn around and say the reason the Bible hardly ever mentions it is because it doesn't necessarily believe in it? And so there are a couple of quotations, 3 quotations that I've given. The first one from the book of Samuel, first book of Samuel. Adonai memit u'mechayeh, the eternal one that brings death and gives life. God lowers to the grave and raises up. Some people say that that is proof of a belief in an afterlife, because you read it sequentially. You say God who brings death and then gives life, if you read it sequentially. But it doesn't have to be. It could be read as God who does both. Now, you might say, if that were true, you would write it in the other way. God who brings life and who brings death. Because chronologically, one always follows from the other. So it could be that the first book of Samuel here is talking about some form of belief in life after death. And certainly there is the idea of the prophet being raised from the dead and saying, "Who disturbed me from my slumber?" And so we're immediately raised with a question as to what happens to a person after they die. And part of this is actually predicated on what is a person. Is a person an entire being in and of themselves, or is a person a body and a soul? Because if a person is a body and a soul, then when the body dies, the question naturally must be, so what happens to the soul? Does the soul die, or does it continue? But if it's not a simple dichotomy between body and soul, then it's perfectly appropriate to say we don't have to have this moment of passing being a moment of transition. And in fact, there are a number of different words for soul in Judaism anyway. Nefesh, neshama, chaya, all these different aspects of the self that sometimes refer to the animus, the thing that motivates us, which is very different to our real being, not being our body, but being something which lives on after death. And I'm going to come back to this later. So you could say this quotation from the first book of Samuel talks about a chronological sequence. God who brings death and then gives life. But then Job, and to be fair, Job is despairing, so he may be bringing a different perspective. Job says, "As a cloud disperses and is gone, so does one who descends to the grave not rise." Seems pretty clear there that the Bible is saying it's done. A person dies and they're done. And I do want to add a little something here, which is that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because we, in our society, we tend to be raised with the idea that a person lives forever. They live in the presence of God. They continue, and that's what's great and wonderful. But more and more I hear people turning around and saying, no, what's wonderful is that I end, is that I have a limit to my life. The quotation, the idea, the rabbinic idea of all my life was learned so that I may die properly. And that the life that is here on earth is the only life that counts. And so even though dying may often be a very painful, terrible thing, death itself doesn't have to be in Judaism. And so when we're talking about life after death, sometimes there's that belief that death must be bad because it's an end, but as the quotation goes, all good things come to an end. So it may not necessarily be seen as a bad idea. So when Job turns around and says, as a cloud disperses and is gone, so does one who descends to the grave not rise. Yes, Job is despairing, but he also may be a pragmatist in some sense. The book of Daniel, and Daniel is very different as a biblical book. The book of Daniel says, many of those who sleep in the dusty earth will awaken, these for everlasting life, and these for shame, for everlasting abhorrence. The wise will shine like the radiance of the firmament, and those who teach righteousness to the multitudes like stars forever and ever. That's an afterlife, for sure. That the book of Daniel is saying that there are two kinds of life after death. There's the good one for good people, and there's the bad one for bad people. This is the only time in the Bible when we have any reference to something like that. And I can't remember where the quotation comes from, and maybe I just wrote this. The doctrine of bodily resurrection is of Persian origin and is alluded to only once in the Bible, in this passage, in the book of Daniel. But by the time of the Mishnah, it's listed as one of the three cardinal Jewish beliefs. So the Mishnah is written around 200 of the Common Era. It's the first rabbinic law code. If you take major Jewish works, you have the Bible, then you have the Mishnah, and then you have the Talmud. Talmud written around 550, 600, 650 of the Common Era. So by the time of the Mishnah, by the time of early rabbinic literature, we definitely have a belief in life in the world to come. And we have some kind of separation between a good life in the world to come and a bad life in the world to come. But before that, in the Bible, it's relatively silent. One thing that we continually hear when somebody dies in the Bible is, and they were gathered to their ancestors. And people would be buried in the same sepulchre, the same family plot, basically a cave or a plot, and they'd be gathered to their ancestors, which for me means name on the family tree, right? And that's your story, and that's great. You have added to the story of humanity, and now your part of the story has finished, but in some sense it never ends because you're always on that family tree. So you're gathered unto your ancestors, and that's it. But by the time of rabbinic literature, particularly because there were other cultures around that had a very clear split between body and soul, which Judaism didn't have in the Bible, suddenly you have this idea of the body dies, but the soul lives on. So now you're faced with a philosophical question, which is, but wait a minute, do I really want to be in the same afterlife? I'm going to be deliberately challenging. Do I want to be in the same afterlife as Hitler? Right? Are we all going to sit in God's presence? That doesn't seem fair. Because if that is the case, why should I do any good on earth? So there must be some sense of reward and punishment if you believe in a separation of body and soul. And so the way that we live our life on earth affects the way that we view the possibility of life in the world to come. So on the next page, page 3, Tractate Sanhedrin. I quoted this morning. I was rather proud of myself. Chapter 10, verse 1. All Israel has a share in the world to come. As it says, your people shall all be righteous. They shall inherit the land forever, a shoot of my planting, my handiwork in which to glory. And these are the ones for whom there is no world to come. The one who says there is no resurrection of the dead from the Torah, the one who says there is no Torah from heaven, and the heretic. So there is an afterlife if you're good little boys and girls. But if you're not, if you deny the fundamental faith according to the Mishnah, if you say Torah didn't come word from God, if you say there is no resurrection of the dead, then you don't get the resurrection of the dead. You don't get the afterlife. You don't deserve it because you don't believe in it. And so we have to be careful, by the way, and I should clarify about resurrection and afterlife. And that's actually where the picture on the front of the handout comes from, which is this idea, do we have this later on? I just want to check. Which is the idea of 6,000 years. I love being alive today. I love my community. I love my family. People say, if you could pick any time in history to live, when would it be? And my answer would be just before the year 6000 in the Jewish calendar. Because people are going to lose their minds. Because there is a perspective, 6 and 7 in particular is a big Jewish number. There are 7 days of the week. And so the rabbinic idea developed that Shabbat is not just God worked 6 days and rested once, but it actually alludes to the history of humanity. That there will be 6,000 years of existence, and then 1,000 years of perfection. So we are all resurrected from the dead at the year 6,000, essentially. We're all resurrected from the dead, and then we have 1,000 years of a blissful world to come. And then God says, very good, thank you very much, we're done now. And I have to say, we're 200 and something years off. But part of me is like, it's going to be crazy around that time. So many people are going to be like, it's here. The resurrection is tomorrow. Let's go, right? So there is a belief in the resurrection, which then leads afterwards to life in the world to come. And so there is a chronology here. What happens in the meantime, though? What happens for all the people who are, who die now, right? What do they do? Where do they go? There is a belief, as we saw from Daniel, this belief in this splitting of positive and negative. And so we have this interesting concept in Judaism called Gehinnom. The Gehinnom literally means the valley of Hinnom. You have the Temple Mount, which was seen to be the center of the entire universe by the rabbis. They thought the earth was flat and there was a domed firmament and everything else revolved around it. And in the center of the earth, according to the rabbis, was Jerusalem, and in the center of that was the temple. So the Temple Mount was literally the center of the universe. It was the holiest place of the universe. It was a place around which everything revolved. And the place around which humanity could meet with God. At the bottom of the hill was the valley of Hinnom. And idolaters used to meet there and do terrible sacrifices and terrible things. And so the rabbis decided to call the negative place afterlife Gehinnom. It's the opposite of the good place. If you've ever seen that show, it really is quite close to Jewish theology. And so life in the world to come, Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, right? We all go to Gan Eden eventually. Some people, however, I shouldn't say we all, so most of us go to Gan Eden eventually. Some people go to this, their souls are extirpated. They're so evil that they can't possibly continue. And God says, I'm sorry, you made so many terrible choices, you're done, you're out. So, to answer that question before, what would happen if I were in the same afterlife as Hitler? The answer would be no, he doesn't get a chance. Most of the rest of us, according to rabbinic literature, most of the rest of us go to a place called Gehinnom. And Gehinnom is essentially Jewish purgatory. But it's a cleansing place. It's cleansed by fire, just as you cleanse other things by fire. And you can be in Gehinnom for up to a year. Now, again, this is the traditional rabbinic perspective as expressed in Mishnah and Talmud. I'm not saying this is necessarily what happens. So in Gehinnom, each of us, because we're not perfect, each of us gets cleansed. So that we can then go and be in the good place. We can sit with crowns on our heads in God's presence. How long are we there for? We are there for a maximum of a year. And so if God sort of looked at your soul and said, it's going to take more than a year to clean you up, that means you're discarded. That's too bad. The really good people go there immediately, go to the good place immediately. Most of the rest of us go to Gehinnom, go to this cleansing place, so that we can be buffed up. Our souls can be buffed up and improved, and then we can sit in God's presence. That leads to a practical consideration. The mourner's Kaddish, the prayer that immediate mourners recite when somebody dies, we recite it for up to 11 months. And there is one custom that says every time you recite the mourner's Kaddish, you cool the fires of Gehinnom for the person who is being cleansed. And that's meant to be a good thing, although I can't help but sit there and think, don't you want them to be out of it quicker? So you shouldn't say it so that they can get it all out of the way and so on. But I think the idea is they're there for 8 months or whatever, so at least cool the fires. Now, just to be clear, I think that's a terrible reason to say Kaddish. Okay, to say mourner's Kaddish. Right? We should say mourner's Kaddish because we're expressing a loss, because we're expressing thanks to God for the person who is in our lives, not because we feel guilty, I didn't say it, so now they're going to burn a bit harder. But the custom is to recite mourner's Kaddish not for the full year, but for 11 months. And the reason that we recite Kaddish for 11 months is because we don't want to imply that our loved one was in Gehinnom for the full 12 months. And so we say, look, they weren't perfect, but I'm going to say it for 11 months. And that's genuinely where the custom of saying Kaddish for 11 months comes from this idea of cooling the fires of Gehinnom. I actually think psychologically saying Kaddish for 11 months is very helpful because then there's that pause before the month of the yahrzeit, and then you have a different sort of access to grief at that point. So, the doctrine of the afterlife was a major part of Pharisaic Judaism. The Sadducees, the temple priests, didn't believe in any of that, right? They believed in animal sacrifice. They believed Judaism is in the here and now. The Pharisees were like, yeah, there's here and now, but there's also life in the world to come. And what happened? The temple was destroyed, and that's where the Sadducees worked. Sadducees were the temple-based cult, and so the Sadducees essentially evaporated. And so what happened was Judaism, which did have two different perspectives, there is no afterlife, God wants the service of animals, and there is an afterlife, and God wants the service of the heart, which is prayer, by intervention from other people, this group were wiped out. So then Judaism immediately shifted to, instead of 3 daily animal sacrifices, we have 3 daily prayer services, Shachrit, Mincha, and Maariv, and the natural belief and life of the world to come. And how did the rabbis, who came from the Pharisees, how did the rabbis justify that? Well, they were wrong, that's why they got wiped out. And so therefore we must be right. But we are able to turn around as contemporary Jews and say, Judaism in temple times had 2 very widely different perspectives on life in the world to come, which the rabbis described as not like this world. In the world to come, there is no eating or drinking, no procreation, no business, no envy, no hatred, no competition. Rather, the righteous sit with crowns on their heads and bask in the splendor of the divine presence. What is the afterlife? It's just constantly. Interestingly, I'm seeing more and more Reform rabbis writing, that doesn't sound very interesting for me. And some people turn around and say, well, it's not meant to be interesting because you can't possibly conceive of what it means to live in the presence of God. So of course you're writing that because you lack imagination. But what is it to be human? Actually, this question of death and beyond, do we exist after life, is actually a question about what is it to be human. And being human is drinking, procreation, business, envy, hatred, competition, if you're lucky. It's the interaction, it's living, it's life, it's actual action and being and responding. So some people look at this text and say, wow, I can't wait. I can't wait to get rid of all this shtuyot, all of this nonsense of life, all the pain, the trauma, the trouble of life, and just sit in the presence of God. And others turn around and say, that doesn't sound like life to me. That doesn't sound like an afterlife. That sounds like I'm just some kind of sitting receptive puppet that doesn't really sound appealing. So the rabbis really were very clear. 7 things were created before the world was created. Torah, repentance, the Garden of Eden, meaning paradise, Gehinnom, the throne of glory, the temple, and the name of the Messiah. And so all of these things are connected. The idea of the Messiah, the Messianic age, the world's redemption, and then a resurrection of the dead. Even so, Genesis Rabbah at the foot of page 3 says, if you see kingdoms contending with each other, look for the foot of the Messiah. In other words, when everything is terrible, that's when the Messiah is going to come. So don't despair. And that's actually a really important thing. That part of this, as we look at what does it mean to have death and beyond, part of this is about despair and hope. It's about the human condition. What does it mean for us to live, to be alive? What does it mean for us to have hope? Is it hope individually? Is it hope communally? Because for the rabbis, the individual hope was tied up with the communal hope. So the idea of the world being redeemed is connected to we are part of something greater. So as we die, so we live to become part of something greater. At the top of page 4, there's a quotation which I adore from Tractate Ta'anit. It says, Rabbi Abahu, more important is a day of rain than the resurrection of the dead. Since the resurrection of the dead is for the righteous and not for the wicked, whereas rain is for both righteous and the wicked. Rabbi Abahu clearly believes in life of the world to come. But Rabbi Abahu, I think, is grounding us in a really important thing, which is that this idea, the rabbinic concept of life of the world to come, is really divisive. Are you a good person? Are you a bad person? Which means, are they a good person or a bad person? Because as soon as you have this concept, you have immediate judgment. You're bringing in judgment into life after death. Do they go to the good place or the bad place? For some rabbis, there was relief. Why is there relief? Because in this world, there seems to be a tendency that bad people are really successful, and good people often aren't. And that doesn't seem fair if God is just. Because God says clearly in Deuteronomy, if you do this, then you'll get this reward, and if you do this, then you'll get bad punishment. But it doesn't seem to happen in the real world. Bad people tend to find power and riches and fame, and good people tend to find each other in community and in small connection. How is it that bad people do so well if God is fair and just? So the rabbis, this is probably where the concept of an afterlife really comes from. Because the rabbis are saying, it's good for them now, but it's only a short now as compared with an eternal later. So you don't need to worry about that person becoming super famous, super successful, super rich, super powerful. Let them have their fun now, because afterwards it's going to be really bad. Meanwhile, you're a good person and you're struggling and life is tough and it's painful and, loved ones are suffering and it's too much for you. But that's because you're getting all the bad stuff out of the way now so that you have an amazing life in the world to come. So when I share this because sometimes belief in the life in the world to come is not about what the scriptures say or anything like that. It's about how do I make sense of the world? How do I make sense of injustice? What do I do with the fact that life is sometimes really tough? So I deliberately don't share what is my perspective on life of the world to come, because I don't want people to go, well, that's what Rabbi Neil feels, so I should probably feel that way, because I'm aware of the power of the rabbi. But I think I totally understand when people believe in the world to come and say, my loved one is here, aren't they? The answer is yes. Yes, they are. They are because you're holding them there. And they exist there. And could I quantify it? Could I measure it? Could I prove it? No. But they are there because that's what helps make sense of the world. And so belief in the world to come, or in life, or in resurrection, anything else like that, actually says a lot about us and the way that we're looking at the world, as opposed to, but what does Judaism say? Because as we can see already, Judaism has a multiplicity of voices on this. So as we start to think about what do I believe in terms of life in the world to come, what we're really saying is, who am I? And how do I make sense of the world around me? And what do I need? Do I need the world to be fair? Do I need the world to be just? Someone in the, we had our Introduction to Reform Judaism course, and every once in a while I share stories of my mother, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And one of the things somebody wrote this morning, I love stories of your mother, so I'm going to share another. When I was a kid, one of the phrases I constantly said was, it's not fair. Right? I had a pretty tough childhood, right? I'd say, it's not fair. My mother would say, life isn't fair. Right? She'd constantly say that to me, right? As opposed to maybe putting an arm around me and saying, I know, and it's painful, and I'm sorry. She was like, life isn't fair. Deal with it, basically. But that's actually really hard for us, right? Because it seems like life isn't fair. So actually what we hold in terms of our belief about life in the world to come is really, in some sense, what do we do with how unfair the world is? So, I'm aware of time. According to rabbinic sources, there are several stages, as I said. There's the period of messianic redemption, and then there's peace throughout nature, Jerusalem rebuilt, the dead are resurrected, and then you go on to the next stage. Let's have a look. You know what? There's a bit about non-Jews, and to be honest, it's Torah. The rabbinic attitude towards non-Jews is ambivalent. There is the quotation, the righteous people of any nation shall have a share in the life of the world to come. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not, if you're a good person or not, that's what matters. Let's move on. Medieval rabbinics, top of page 5. Saadia Gaon, extraordinary medieval author, says there are two final stages of human existence. He says the messianic period will be inhabited by the remnant of the righteous of Israel who will be allowed to participate in the restoration of the monarchy, Jewish monarchy. At that stage, poverty, oppression, and conflict will disappear. Eventually, the world to come will be established. The dead of all nations will be rewarded, and recompense will take place through the medium of the divine light. The righteous will be illuminated with joy, whereas the wicked will be consumed by fire. Some people find this very comforting. I find this deeply challenging, maybe even disturbing. Because I believe, I hope, and again, I'm expressing my own, I believe not necessarily in the goodness of humanity, but I hate the idea that the end of humanity is in you are cast up and you are cast down. That to me is not a theology that I look forward to. And it's worth saying, by the way, that Reform Judaism, in our Siddur, in the second paragraph of Tefillah, which we'll come to later, the second paragraph of Tefillah had Mechayeh Meitim, God who resurrects the dead, or who gives life to the dead. And the Reform movement took that out and said, I see what Judaism said in the past, but that doesn't seem to speak to us now. Maimonides, a very dualistic thinker, was convinced that the state of ultimate blessedness could only be reserved for the soul alone. Maimonides has this extraordinary view of the afterlife. We tend to think, particularly because we're influenced by Hellenistic thought, which separates body and soul. We tend to think the body dies, the body isn't the real essence of the person, the soul is the real essence of the person, and that somehow lives on. Maimonides says it's not that simple. In essence, for Maimonides, and I'm really summarizing, in essence, for Maimonides, what a person learns in their life is what lives on. So, to take a practical example, at some point in your life you learned that 1 + 1 = 2. So then Maimonides would say, after you die, your 1 + 1 = 2-ness is what survives. Everything that you learn from the moment your soul is created, in any way that it develops, that is what remains. Not that you remain in all your personality and character and so on, but your soul, because he did believe in a separation, your soul, what lives on, is how that soul developed and grew. That's a very different sense of life after death. There is also, and I'm always hesitant to bring this up, there is also a belief in reincarnation, which appears in medieval mysticism. This is a concept of Gilgul, it's called. So metempsychosis, a nice word. This is a quotation that comes from, this is a very long quotation. I don't know where I got this one. I'm pretty sure it's the Jewish Encyclopedia. In contrast with the conspicuous opposition of Jewish philosophy, metempsychosis is taken for granted in its Kabbalah from the Sefer HaBahir. And it comes from Ecclesiastes. One generation passes away and another generation comes. So one form of Kabbalah, because Kabbalah does not speak in a monolithic voice, one form of Kabbalah says that's causative. As one generation dies, so the next appears. And so it takes this idea of the transmigration of souls. The idea that the soul essentially lives on. Further down, let's see there. Oh, and this was also the idea of the transmigration of souls from one body to the next. Was this idea? It addressed the idea of justice again. You know, if somebody had something bad happen to them in this world, that's okay, because next time they'll have something good in the next world, and it keeps going in a cyclical basis. That therefore demonstrates that God is just. Now, it's a very long quotation. I'm not going to read all of it. But I share it because as I said at the beginning, there is no one Jewish belief on life after death. And the fact that medieval Kabbalah even went to the point of picking up on the concept of reincarnation, of the transmigration of souls, shows that yes, there are some who will say Judaism believes, because that's what's in the Mishnah and the Talmud. But, as you may know, I suspect it's true, that not all Jews read Mishnah and Talmud. And not all Jews believe everything that's in the Mishnah and Talmud. And that's actually a strength of Judaism, not a weakness. That we have differing Jewish beliefs and perspectives. And the fact is that we can take and we can ground those different beliefs in the same source text. In the Torah, for example, or the Tanakh in the Bible. So one person can turn around and say, I believe in this, aspect of life after death because it says it's in the book of Daniel. And someone else can say, but I believe in the transmigration of souls because of this one phrase in Ecclesiastes. And someone can say, I believe that there is no life after death because of what happens in Genesis when they die and that's it. All of those are correct. Let's look at page 7, and then I'm going to take some questions and thoughts and comments. I'm 13 years old, 14 years old. I'm in a class taught by Reverend Lindsay, who is our religious education teacher at my school. And I'm literally the only Jew in the comparative religion class. All the other Jews went to study Judaism because they knew it already and it was easy. And me, Nebish, I'm like, I want to go and learn about other religions actually. It's actually quite interesting. So Reverend Lindsay is there and he's teaching us about life after death. And he says, and Jews believe that there is a resurrection of the body and of the soul. I put my hand up and said, no, we don't. He said, you do. I said, we don't? That's crazy. Why would you say that? Of course we don't believe in them. So I went to my rabbi, Rabbi Simon Francis of blessed memory, and I said, what is this guy talking about? How is this Christian chaplain saying we believe in life after death? And Rabbi Simon showed me to Yigdal. Yigdal Elohim Chai v'yihishta habach. We sang it at the end of every service on the Friday night. And what does it mean? At the end of days, one paragraph, at the end of days an anointed one will come redeeming those who wait for God to save. Meitim yachaye el barov chasto. Life beyond all death God gives with great love. I thought, I should probably read the translation of these prayers before I sing them. And I turned to Simon, Rabbi Simon, and I said, I don't know what to do with this, because as I was then, I don't believe in this. I don't believe that, why are you saying this to me? This is brand new to me. We've never had anything, we've never even discussed this. And what he said to me is, this is what Maimonides said. Yigdal is Maimonides' declaration of faith, his 13 principles, essentially. And he says, you're a Jew if you believe these things. And if you don't believe them, you're out of the club. And that was fine for Maimonides to be able to believe because he was very focused on intellectualism. As opposed to actually the rest of the community. And some people just like coming to services. And some people like to be on the board. And some people like to study philosophy. And some people like to give tzedakah. And you're all Jewish, right? Everyone's Jewish. You don't have to believe certain things to be Jewish. But what's interesting is that Yigdal made its way into the liturgy, especially on Friday night, to say, by the way, everyone, before you go home, make sure you believe this. And it's actually very interesting that the Reform movement in America really has basically taken Yigdal out. It's in the Siddur, but it's very rare that we sing it. I like to sing it before the High Holy Days, just because I think the High Holy Day tune is really lovely. Yigdal Elohim Chai v'yishtabach. And that's the thing. It's a lovely tune and it's actually really reflective. Just please don't think about the words. That's actually a really interesting rabbinic perspective here. But it's okay to say that's what they believed, and now what do I believe? As opposed to because they believe that, I must believe this. And so that leads into this discussion of the second paragraph of Tefillah. Mechaye meitim barachamim rabim. It says, see below for translation. This is from Rabbi Jonathan Romain in England, from his book Faith and Practice. Among Reformed Jews, the belief in the literal resurrection of the body is no longer maintained. Interesting that he speaks with such clarity. You know, the essence of Reformed Judaism is diversity. We don't tell you what you have to believe. But he turns around here in this book, which was 1990, I think, and says, we don't believe this anymore. We're done with it. He says, only the belief in the immortality of the soul is accepted. And that's really interesting because Reformed Judaism says you can believe in the idea of the soul continuing, but the idea of resurrection of the dead, no, we don't go there. The difference between the Reformed position and that of the Orthodox is reflected in the different Reformed translation of the above blessing, which is rendered instead as, blessed are you, Lord, who renews life beyond death. Now, Mechaye, the one who brings life, Meitim, to the dead. So what does it mean, Machaye Meitim, the one who gives life to the dead? Traditionally it was you die and then you are given life again. But you're given life again in terms of resurrection. But the Reform movement turned around in England and said, no, you're given life again in the world to come. Not that you walk around on earth. And there's a really interesting perspective. You know, if you think the world's crowded now, right? When you look at the entirety of human history, if everyone is resurrected, you know, what does that mean? It makes sense to believe that maybe 2,000 years ago when there were far fewer people. But what does that mean? How are they fed? And the answer traditionally is, of course they're fed. It's the perfect time. So the trees blossom. Even trees that aren't fruit trees become fruit trees and so on. It becomes a supernatural, wondrous state. But Reform movement in England said, God who renews life beyond death, referring to the immortality of the soul, not the resurrection of the body. In fact, there was a translation beforehand, God who quickenest the dead. And they translated it that way, and everyone said, what does that mean? They said, oh, it's kind of up to you. Because we didn't want to be specific. What's interesting is that Mishkan Tefillah says, can we stop saying this? Can we stop saying Machaye Meitim entirely? You can actually, since we're all sitting here in the pews, we can actually open up a Siddur in front of you. Let's find an example. If we look at page 50 in this Siddur, right? Atah gibor le'elam Adonai mechaye hakol with meitim in parentheses. Atah rav lahoshia. You are forever mighty, Adonai. Mechaye hakol. You give life to all. And then it has the meitim in parentheses because it's saying these are the traditional words. And if you want to say the traditional words, you can. If you want to say mechaye meitim, God who brings life to the dead, then say it. But if you want to, you can just say mechaye hakol, God who brings life to all. And that totally changes the underlying message of this blessing. Because mechaye meitim is talking about life after death. Mechaye hakol is about life. God who brings life to all. Now, you could use that to say that includes the dead. And so that's actually why this is a very interesting change. But this is a profound change in liturgy and in Reformed thought. By moving from Mechaye HaMeitim, God who brings life to the dead, to Mechaye HaKol, God who brings life to all, which is basically saying, it's up to you how you translate it. What slightly frustrates me is the translation that they give. You give life to all, parentheses, revive the dead. But that's the point, right? Not that you necessarily revive the dead, but you could translate it as who give life to the dead, in other words, in Olam Haba, in the world to come, right? It's not necessarily about revive. But this is an interesting reflection of Reformed Judaism trying to balance tradition and modernity. And here, I think the inclusion of Hakol is a very positive way to update our liturgy. I think the translation falls a little short. Let me round off with a couple of comments, and then I'll take questions and thoughts. Comes from Mordechai Kaplan at the very bottom of page 8. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan became, he didn't mean to start a new movement, but he started Reconstructionist Judaism. This happens a lot, by the way. That people who start new movements, it's normally not them, it's normally their son-in-law. Interestingly enough, Chabad is the same thing, Hasidic Judaism is the same thing, Reconstructionism is the same thing. It's the son-in-law who says, father-in-law, you've got a really good idea here, and this needs to be something separate. And Reconstructionism is one of those movements. Mordechai Kaplan wrote, "We cannot afford to treat the ancient beliefs concerning afterlife as mere fictions of the imagination. They are undoubtedly an expression of the divine urge in man not to live only for himself in the present moment, but also for mankind in its future. To limit our perspective on human life to the span of our earthly existence would destroy all values. Insofar as the good we do while we live bears fruit after we are gone, we have a share in the world to come. To be sure, we will not be there to enjoy the good achieved, but to ask that we be is to refuse to accept the limitations which God places on individual life. There's a book called Who Needs God, written by Harold Kushner. The spine to the book is deeply unfortunate, because the spine reads, Who Needs God? Harold Kushner. But in that book, Harold Kushner expresses something different to Kaplan. Kushner says that in Judaism we have Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba, this world and the world to come. And that's a phrase you've heard me say a lot, the world to come. This world and the world to come. And Kushner says, in the past, the rabbis understood the world to come meaning some other supernatural place. There is this world grounded in reality, and there is the world to come, which is a totally different reality which we cannot comprehend. Kushner says, I don't find that comforting. He said, I like to read this differently, as this world and this world to come. What does that mean? That means that we can still have a positive world to come or a negative world to come. A positive world to come would be, when we die, we have left the world a better place for our having lived in it. And people speak about us in that way. People say it was good that they were here, that the world is poorer for them not being here now, but it is better that they existed. Kushner says that is Gan Eden. That's the perfect place. That's where you want to be in the world. Not in some supernatural place, but here, amongst the living on, so that people turn around and say, I want you to live on through the way that I behave, the way that I act, through the stories that I tell. And the opposite applies, which is, how do you get to Gehinnom, or to a bad place? It's when people say, thank God they are no longer here. Right? The world is a poorer place for them having lived in it. And so, for Kushner, that is the negative world to come. So I've shared a lot of perspectives in the last hour that demonstrates, I hope, that there is no one Jewish belief in the world to come. The Bible is almost totally silent on it. And if you want, you can take that as Morris Lamb did to say, well, that's because it's obvious, it obviously exists. Or if you want, you can turn around and say, that's because it didn't believe in it then. Because Judaism hadn't mixed with Hellenism, which was very clearly bound with a dualistic structure, man, woman, body, soul in particular. And Hellenism particularly had this concept of an afterlife, of that soul continuing. And Judaism picks up on the religions of the world, and it often turns around and says, we see what other people are doing, how do we make it Jewish? And so you could say this belief in the world to come has always existed in Judaism, and it was brought out more coincidentally when the Jewish community mixed with the Hellenistic community who absolutely believed in that thing. Or you could say that the Bible isn't really, is almost agnostic about view of the world to come, and that Judaism developed, that Judaism is an evolving religious civilization, to quote Kaplan. And therefore, we picked up a belief in the world to come. And at the time, there were two schools of thought. One was the more traditional biblical one, which said animal sacrifice, no life in the world to come. And there was another one that said, no, new religion, new version of Judaism, there is life in the world to come. This one dies out, so this one becomes mainstream. But even when it becomes mainstream, it's not the only voice, because we have the idea of Gilgul, of transmigration of souls and so on. And so then what's interesting is that the Reform movement comes along in the 1800s and says, but we no longer hold by that mainstream perspective either. And we don't necessarily believe in a resurrection of the dead. But ultimately, in Reform Judaism in particular, it's not for me to say. It's not for us to say. Because each person's experience of life is different, and each person's experience of death is different. So in one funeral, I can be standing there with someone and they can say they're gone. And it was good that they were here, but they're gone. And in another funeral, someone can sit next to me or stand next to me and say, they're in a better place now, aren't they? Or they're living with God now, aren't they? Or they're looking down on me, aren't they? And the answer to both of them is yes. And that's okay. Any thoughts, questions, comments? Stumble for silence. So, if there are no thoughts, questions, or comments, let me end with this then. Oh, go on. Yeah, yes. Yeah, Jane. Super loud, Jane. So El Malay Rachamim talks about the departing of the soul. Where does that fit in with our community? So the book that I use for funerals is a book that I brought from England. I actually prefer it to the rabbi's manual that they give you at CCAR. And when they were rewriting the book, I actually spoke to Rabbi Jonathan Maganat, the editor, and I said, but what about people who don't believe in a separation of body and soul? And he said, write it. I was like, I don't have time to write it. I was like, my community's in crisis. And like, there's so much going on, I don't have time. And I really deeply regret it. Because our funeral liturgy still talks in that mainstream voice of separation of body and soul. There are, however, readings of which provide a larger variety of theological perspectives. But it also comes back to Yigdal, when I said, it's got a lovely tune, but don't think about the words. When do I sing El Malay Rachamim as a funeral? I sing it very deliberately as the coffin is being lowered, assuming that in there for a burial as opposed to cremation. And I should say, by the way, and I didn't mention it, and I appreciate you leading me to that. In Reform Judaism, we do cremate. The belief against cremation comes from the belief in the resurrection of the body. And so if the body is going to be resurrected, then you need to have a body to resurrect. I come from England. England is a small country, smaller than New Mexico. It's an island and there's not much space. I was in England for nearly 10 years. 60% of the funerals that I did were cremations. I prefer burial. And I prefer burial because I think it gives people a place. Although some people cremate and then bury the ashes. I think burial gives people a place. Sometimes for some people, cremation is very kind. I have a relative who said, I can't handle the idea of a body being lowered into the ground. And so cremation is the kindest thing. And when my grandfather died, and he was cremated, that person cried the loudest when the cremation started. And I actually spoke to them afterwards and said, I wasn't like, no, I told you. But I said, it's not so kind either way, right? In fact, cremation can be, if you go into the whole process of cremation and if you watch what happens behind the scenes, it's actually quite abrupt, what happens to the body. And there are some people who don't cremate because they say quite specifically, and Rabbi Schwab, my predecessor, was one of them, who says, after the Holocaust, when they deliberately burned our bodies, why would you want to do that to your own body? And that's fair. I understand people who dislike cremation. But the question about burial and cremation actually was a question that I was asked when I was interviewed here. They asked me questions about what is Reform Judaism, and then they asked me scenarios. And this is genuinely a true story. It was back in that room, and there were like 16 people sitting around the table. It was a massive panel. And they said to me, here's a scenario. Somebody comes to you to ask for cremation. What do you do? And I looked at them and went, give them a cremation. And the whole interview panel went, and I thought, oh no, I've thrown this job. And I said, why wouldn't I? I said, Reform Judaism in this country has been doing cremation since the 1890s. Why wouldn't I? And it turned out that Rabbi Schwab had a very different perspective on cremation to me. And he and I have a fascinating conversation about this. To the point that if you look at not Rabbi Schwab's last entry in the bulletin, but his penultimate one, once he knew I was hired, he wrote an entire article about why cremation is wrong. And he and I spoke about it, and I actually called him up. I was like, really, Marvin? I was like, really? That's the leaving shot you want to give them? And he and I joke about it. It's a positive thing. But that belief in what to do with the body also comes from the belief in what happens in the world to come. So so that comes into, I sing El Malei Rachamim. El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamomim, as the coffin's being lowered. I don't think anyone cares what it says at that point. And you're right, in some sense, but it needs to make sense theologically. But actually the focus is on where is that person now? And where is my loss now? Where is my grief now? And for some people, there is a belief in that this person, I'm lowering the body and they have their soul is going somewhere else. That's why, in fact, when you give a eulogy at a funeral, traditionally, you talk about the person as though they are there. Traditionally, you talk about them in the present tense because you're giving them the send-off before they go. So you don't say this person was, traditionally, you say this person is. I tend not to do that because actually I think people tend to find that now really jarring. And actually using was language helps people on that journey of grief. So for some people, even though Al Malei Rachamim, even though it's quite deliberately talking about body and soul, for some people that would not be authentic, and for some people that would. And that's the challenge of shared liturgy, I guess. And so sometimes if I meet with a grieving family, they'll say, please make sure that it's in Hebrew, please make sure it's in English, please make sure to include this song, please make sure that the focus is on this aspect of the person as opposed to the body and soul. Because in some sense, when it comes to a funeral, in some sense it deeply matters. And in some sense, what is a funeral? It's that moment of love. It's a ritual of love, a ritual of loss. And so therefore, where are they now? They're in the coffin. That's what we know. Is that all of them? Maybe, maybe not. It's a good question. Thank you. Yeah.
So I'm going to get this wrong, I think. As there are many Judaisms, there are also many Buddhisms.
Okay.
And at least in one strain, my understanding is there's a sense of it's the spark of life that returns to the origin of the spark of life, which is a little like the soul departing, but it's a not conscious entity. That spark of life simply returns to the source.
Okay.
It strikes me, and I want to see your perspective on this, that some of this dichotomy is literally about not just our perspective of where that person is, but is that person? Is there a consciousness there that experiences something,
Right.
whether it's sitting in the presence of God or not? Or is there simply something that returns to the source?
So thank you. One of the sources which I didn't get to talks about Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. And this is a Kabbalistic perspective that in the beginning there's this supernal light that is held in vessels that are not perfect. And so that light, so the vessels shatter. It's called Shvirat HaKelim. The vessels shatter and the pure light is scattered throughout creation. And so our role is to reassemble those sparks, to bring them back to the divine source, to elevate the sparks that are in everything. And so we say a blessing. The example I always give, there is a spark in the apple. How do you elevate the apple? How do you return the spark? You say the blessing, Borei Peri Ha'etz. You sanctify the apple, you bring up that spark, and then that is returned. That's actually the origin of the phrase Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam, nowadays, most Reformed Jews understand as repairing the world, meaning social justice. That's not what it meant originally in Kabbalah. Tikkun Olam is repairing the world of broken fragments and broken shards of light and returning them. It is not too much of a stretch to therefore say that one perspective on life after death is returning of that spark. It's not just the spark that is in other things, but the spark that's in ourselves as well. And so that is similar to one of the Kabbalistic perspectives on life after death. So you didn't get it wrong. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, concerns?
Just a quick comment on your comment about the tune versus the words. Last week I've been watching YouTube videos, different versions of Paul Simon's Sound of Silence, and your comment there was perfect for listening to people's beautiful versions of the lyrics of Paul Simon. That you can't understand all of the words. You don't have to.
Thank you. This is one of the reasons why our community brought in a cantor. Because my voice is very limited, because Judaism isn't just about the word. It is, we are the people of the book, but we're not slaves to the book. And so the experience of silence sometimes, which I appreciate with my verbosity, does not appear often. But the sound of the words, sometimes the alliteration of the Hebrew, the tune which we give it can take our prayer. Because what is prayer? Prayer is not reading the words on a page. Prayer is our response to what happens when we read the words on a page. If prayer were just reading the words out loud, then it's a play. It's a reading of a script, right? Prayer has to be that which moves our soul. Prayer is our soul's response to the liturgy. And so therefore, it's about the words, but it's not about the words. And sometimes it's about the tune that we attach to those words. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Are you going to add something at the end as well? Yeah.
Or you don't want to go on the fly.
No, okay, fine. I couldn't remember if we were having you add things at the end based on.
I would say that the next conversations on planning for the end of life, as well as the preparation of Jewish rituals of Shmira, Tahara, and at the Tahara, the soul and the body are there,
Right.
and the respect for that individual is handled as if they are sitting there
Yep.
with you.
Yep.
Hence, what you're saying, how you're praying, just even if you're just quiet, to be respectful of the person who's passed away, their soul is still not finished, so
Right.
to speak.
Right. Thank you. Some of what I have shared today may be comforting, some may be uncomfortable. And I mean that in terms of theology and in terms of practice. You may have heard me talk about cremation and think, ooh, no. And that's okay. And you may have heard me talk about resurrection and you, no. And that's okay. As I said at the beginning, when we talk about life after death, what we're really talking about is life. Who is a person? Who defines a person? What does it mean to be a human being? And there is no one perspective on this in Judaism. When we talk about this, it naturally pulls at us in different ways. It affects us if there is someone who is close to death, who we know. If there is no one who is death, who we know, close to death, who we know. If we have lost someone, it speaks to us very differently at different times in our lives. And so I want to end by saying, yeah, there's text. And yes, there's philosophy and theology. But ultimately, this is about the transition through life. This is about our journey through life and our journey through grief and loss. So if this presentation has brought up anything for you that is challenging or comforting, that is illuminating or difficult, and that you need to talk about it further, then just come to me. Come and talk to me and say, look, okay, this brought this out for me. Because because the Jewish community exists to help people through life, which necessarily means through death. And death and grief is the price of love. Grief is the cost of love. And so when we talk about this, In some sense, it's fine to talk about the abstract theology of it. But ultimately, what we're really talking about is our loved ones and ourselves and what happens to us as our being. Who am I? The phrase in the liturgy, Ma anu, mer chayenu. What are we? What is our life? And that's ultimately the question for all of us. And so, looking at death brings that question into sharp focus. So that if this is touched on anything that you need to talk more about, genuinely, please just email me, call the office, set a time, and let's get together and talk. So thank you. Thank you to all of you. I really appreciate this, and if you need me for further conversation, we can't do it here because there's going to be a Purim spiel rehearsal in about 10 minutes' time, but please do reach out. Thank you, everyone.
Is that for me?
That's for you.
Wow.
I went to Party City, I saw it on the top shelf, I said, oh my God, he has to go. Looks like Burger King.
Oh, to practice with. Oh, yeah. I don't know how many.
I really appreciate it because it's family, it's possession. I listen and I look and I see and I listen.
I have a question for you. Do you sing the verse in the first song tradition? Do you sing the verse for Esther and then we will go?
You know, that's probably best.
Okay, so we need to change those rules. So this is my idea. Because whether you're talking about Russia in the 1890s or biblical Persian, forget about no Hebrew stories. Like the women wouldn't worry and they wouldn't learn to trade. So I came up with two. You could choose which one you want. So one is at 3 I started cooking meals. At 10 I learned to pray. I hear they've got a man for marriage. Okay.
That's great.
Right? Okay, so the other one is at 3 my mother taught me prayers. At 10 I learned to
got a raise in January. I was here just long enough
Yeah,
to not have to do a performance appraisal
yeah, cool.
yet.
Was that the special inflation?
Nope, it was just timing. It was just my timing of it. And I raised my retirement contributions already for more, and I'm still able to put a bunch away. And so I can I bought a roll-up deck, and that's my most exciting thing.
You tell me if it works.
Oh, it's
because
great.
Oh, you'll call
You
me
still,
about it.
you still need to have the edges,
Yeah.
but I call him Kitty, but baby Kitty. I'm like, Kitty, where are you? She does a great job, and he's like, help, help, when my hair gets longer around here, and I have to cut it out, but.
I know it, it's wonderful.
Okay,
but
we're
don't
practicing
have
now.
it. Oh, you're
Okay,
practicing.
so,
I'm doing the thing.
Okay.
two questions.
Yes.
Number one, have you both been practicing with the recording?
I did.
Yes,
And is that key
Yeah.
okay?
seems
good
okay
for
to me.
Okay, that's great.
Again,
That's great,
I'm
'cause that's
slightly coughing,
the key that I've
but I'm
got.
getting better and better with my coughing.
And the other thing is just, I think this is Mike, right, where you say, for 10,000 talents,
Yeah.
this stupid dope bought his plan, now you hope I'll punish him, get a rope. That is the only reference whatsoever to what has happened here, right? And that Haman is going to die instead of Mordecai, right? So I think what we really have to do is practically stop at that moment.
Okay.
And go get a rope is like exaggerated and spoken. So I was saying for 10,000 talents, this stupid dope bought his plan, now you hope I'll punish him. Get a rope! Right, and
That's
then-
exactly what
right,
I had.
Yeah, we sort of,
And then go on.
this song is basically talking except for the singing, do you love me?
What?
In a way, so it's great, I know, but I mean,
Let's
it's
just do it.
it's great to do that.
Is this loud enough for you?
Yeah.
Okay. So, so
We
what
start
are,
out with,
You can start the.
I say, oh, what can I do?
right, that line before it, right? Something
Yeah.
about love?
Yeah, well, this is the thing, they're really good about, and I say, oh, what can I do? Make a new world. A new world. Love. My king.
No, just speak spoken first for now.
My king, do you love me?
Do I what?
Do you love me?
Do I love you?
No. Do I love you?
Do I love you? I saw you in the lineup and I chose you.
I saw you in the lineup and I chose you as my queen.
You're obsessed.
Right.
You're worn out. Go inside, go lie down.
Go down.
Maybe it's indigestion.
I'm asking you a question. Do you love me? Do you? Do you love
No, listen. Do you love me?
Do you?
Do you?
Do you love
Too high.
love me?
Okay,
Do you love me?
good.
You're a fool.
I know,
Wait, I lost my place. Okay,
I know, but do you love me?
Do I love you? My very best servants wash your clothes, cook your meals, clean your house. I offered you half my kingdom. Wow.
so I think the wow should be her. Or so, I mean, why would you say I offered you
Because it
half my
says
kingdom?
cow.
Wow,
Because it says cow.
right?
Well, it's like, wow.
Oh, okay. So then do
Yeah.
right. So if you do it like
Right.
that, right? So instead of a statement,
Yeah.
it's like it's like you're remembering. I offered you half my kingdom. Wow.
Yeah.
You know? Okay. Good. I offered you.
And
Good.
then I forgot the melody.
I offered. Just to take it from do I love you?
You, my very best servants, wash your clothes, cook your meals, clean your house. I offered you half my kingdom. Wow. After all, what's the melody?
Wow. After all, you're my
punish him. Get a rope! If that's not love, what is?
Then you love me.
I suppose I do.
Good. And I suppose I love you too. It changes everything for Jews and so you
I am keeping my name. It's nice to
Okay, so we'll work on that.
Yeah.
It's like
It's nice.
so who's gonna take the top?
Well, I can do it if you want. Actually, it might be better. It's better for my way.
To right. That's it. Right. And your right. And yours? Yes. So let's just try to do that. I'll give you the chord, and then you're on your own with that harmony if we can do it.
It's nice to
Perfect.
So I sing this, right, it changes everything for Jews and so. That's the
Actually,
You know, you can actually sing that together, I think,
yeah,
right?
you can
So it
tell.
changes everything
it is
for
meant
Jews.
everybody because it's Esther, but that's a typo.
Right, so you sing, it changes everything for Jews and so, and then you sing, I'm keeping my queen. And you can sing actually, you're keeping your queen. So you can keep singing together, I think, through that whole part. Right, so it changes everything.
For Jews and
Good one.
I am keeping my queen.
No, you are keeping your queen, right? You're talking to him, right?
I am keeping my queen. It's nice to know.
Good. Excellent. So the one phrase that you can practice is the "Do I love you?" Right? So,
Do I love
no, so let's see. Wait. Do you love me? Do I want?
Oh, well, let's
Do
make
you
it.
love me? Do I love? No. Do I love you?
Do I love
Let's see. That's the melody. I love you.
There's trouble in the town there, I'm asking. Do I what? Do you love?
Oh, this is a completely different version.
I love you.
Yeah,
Oh,
it is.
that's horrible.
Then the
That's
Dropbox.
horrible.
I have the Dropbox on my phone.
No, but they're not even singing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they don't kind of sing, but.
Well, on those lines they do.
On that Do You Love
She hits that note. Do I what? You know? Even though she's almost
So I don't
talking.
listen to that version.
Yeah, the Dropbox
So
version?
you have the links
I
there,
haven't listened
right?
to it, but I
Oh.
have the links.
That's what I've been
Yeah,
singing.
yeah.
So,
Because also that's in this key.
trying to listen to.
Got it.
But it, that's I love you. Right? Okay. So anyway, all right. So give me your line. Give me your line again. Before.
The initial one?
Yeah. And then how do you want to find your starting note? Will you just learn it, or should I give it to
I
you?
think, Fred, you should play it.
Yeah.
I can actually play that whole line first, and then we'll play it again. So you can say love,
So I
right?
say,
Isn't that
oh,
your
what can
last
I
word?
do? Make a new world, love.
And I can go